transparent.
I've been feeding the same Bigfoot since 1986, and what he finally revealed to me about why his kind fears humans will haunt me forever. My name is Thomas McKenna. I'm 66 years old, a retired forest ranger from Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. After nearly 4 decades of keeping this secret, it's time the world knows the truth. October 15th, 1986. I was 28 years old, a newly appointed forest ranger fresh out of Oregon State University. It was late afternoon when I arrived to investigate damage at an old hunting cabin 6 miles from the main trail. A local family had reported their storage shed torn apart. As I approached the clearing, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The destruction wasn't typical of bears. I'd seen plenty of bear damage during my training. This was different. The shed's door hadn't just been clawed open. It had been wrenched completely off its hinges with what must have been incredible force. Large, deep impressions in the soft earth around the structure caught my attention immediately. I knelt down to examine them more closely. Pulling out my measuring tape and camera, the prints were enormous, at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the widest part. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, with 5 distinct toe impressions, but far too large to be human. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy, probably weighing between 600 and 800 pounds, based on my estimates. My heart began to race. In all my training, in all the wildlife manuals I'd studied, nothing quite matched what I was seeing. I spent the next hour documenting everything, taking photographs, making plaster casts, measuring the 6-foot stride length. But the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of animals, just eerie silence. My hand moved to the bear spray on my hip. That's when I heard it. A sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A low, guttural vocalization that seemed to resonate through the trees themselves. Not quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something in between, something that spoke of intelligence and awareness. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards away. Every instinct told me to run, but my training kicked in. I slowly backed toward my truck parked on the dirt road about 50 yards from the cabin. My eyes scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. Between 2 massive cedar trees, partially obscured by shadow and undergrowth, stood a figure. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it as a person in a dark coat, maybe another hiker. But as my eyes adjusted and the figure shifted slightly, that rationalization crumbled completely. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb the fading light. Broad shoulders that would make an NFL linebacker look small, and it was watching me. I froze. Every wildlife safety protocol I'd ever learned suddenly seemed inadequate. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't supposed to exist. The creature didn't move aggressively. It simply stood there, partially hidden, observing me with what I can only describe as curiosity. I could make out a face, though not clearly in the shadows. Dark eyes that reflected a glimmer of the remaining daylight. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't say if we stood there staring at each other for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost inquisitive. Then, with a movement so swift and fluid, it seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I didn't remember getting into my truck. The next thing I clearly recalled was sitting behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I arrived back at the ranger station just after sunset, my supervisor, Bill, took one look at my pale face, and immediately poured me a cup of coffee. I couldn't tell him what I'd really seen. Bill would think I'd lost my mind, that I couldn't handle the isolation of the job. So I lied and said I'd had a close call with what might have been a bear, but I documented everything in private. The measurements, the photographs, the plaster casts. And for weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that encounter. The intelligence in those eyes. The deliberate way it had observed me without attacking. The almost human quality of its curiosity. I began returning to that area whenever my patrol route allowed it. I started leaving offerings, apples at first, then dried meat, nuts, berries. I placed them on a flat granite outcropping near a stream, always in the same spot. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Then one morning in late October, I arrived to find the food gone. No wrapper left behind, no scattered remains, just gone, taken cleanly. This continued through the winter. I'd leave food, it would disappear. I never saw who took it, but I knew. Then one evening in late November, as fog rolled thick through the valley, I arrived at the granite outcropping to find him waiting for me. The same creature from October, sitting on the ground near where I always left my offerings. He didn't run when he heard me approach. He simply watched me with those dark, intelligent eyes. I stopped about 20 feet away, my heart hammering in my chest. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. Then slowly, deliberately, I pulled fresh apples from my backpack and placed them on the rock. I backed away carefully, my movements measured and non-threatening. He watched every motion I made. When I was far enough back, he reached forward with one massive hand and took an apple. He examined it briefly, then ate it methodically, his eyes never leaving mine. When the apples were gone, he made a soft sound, almost like a grunt of satisfaction. Then he stood and walked calmly into the forest. That was the beginning. Over the following months and years, our encounters became regular. I learned his patterns, when he was most likely to appear. What areas he favored, I learned his preferences too. He liked apples best, especially Honeycrisp and Fuji varieties, but also accepted venison jerky, walnuts, and occasionally honey, which he seemed to consider a delicacy. I named him Jack, though I'm certain he had no concept of human names. He was massive, probably 9 feet tall when standing fully upright, with thick dark brown fur that grayed at the temples as the years passed. His hands were enormous, easily twice the size of mine, capable of incredible strength. Yet he handled food with surprising delicacy. We developed a language of sorts over those years. Gestures, sounds, body language. He taught me what meant safe, what meant danger, what meant gratitude. A particular low rumble meant he was relaxed. A sharper sound meant I should leave. A touch to a tree trunk, gentle and deliberate, meant this place was important. A kind of marker or memory. I learned to read his moods, his needs, his boundaries. In the spring of 1994, 8 years after our first meeting, Jack did something unexpected. He brought his family. I arrived at our usual meeting spot to find not just Jack, but 2 others. A female, slightly smaller than him, perhaps 8 feet tall, with lighter brown fur, and a juvenile, maybe 4 feet tall, with darker fur and enormous eyes full of curiosity. I understood immediately what Jack was showing me. Trust, the deepest kind of trust. He was introducing me to the most important beings in his life, revealing a vulnerability that could cost them everything if I betrayed it. The female hung back at first, watching me warily, positioning herself protectively near the young one. But the juvenile was curious, peering around its mother to stare at me with what I can only describe as wonder. I brought extra food that day and every day after. I started bringing variety, fresh salmon when I could get it, sweet corn in summer, winter squash. They accepted it all. The female, whom I thought of as Sarah, though I never spoke the name aloud, warmed to me gradually over time. The young one, full of energy and playfulness, reminded me heartbreakingly of a human child. Over the next several years, I watched that young one grow. I watched the family unit operate with a sophistication that shattered every assumption I'd ever had about animal behavior. They communicated through soft vocalizations, through touches, through expressions that were hauntingly human. Sarah had a scar across her left shoulder. Old and healed Jack's hands bore marks of past injuries. They had histories, experiences, losses. I protected them the only way I knew how. I quietly discouraged hikers from certain areas, citing bear activity or unstable terrain. I redirected hunting parties. I filed vague reports that kept people away from their territory. In return, they trusted me with their secret, their existence, their lives. But that trust was tested severely in March of 2003. I arrived at our meeting spot on a cold morning to find Jack waiting, but not in his usual calm manner. He was agitated, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the forest constantly. He made urgent sounds I'd never heard before, a kind of distressed chittering that raised the hair on my neck. Then he gestured for me to follow, something he'd only done a handful of times before. We moved deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone with him, through terrain I barely knew. After about 20 minutes of difficult hiking, we reached a small grove of ancient cedars. And there, in the shelter of those ancient trees, I found her. Sarah was lying on her side on a bed of ferns, breathing shallowly, her eyes half closed. Blood matted the fur on her left rib cage, dark and wet. The juvenile, now nearly full-grown, knelt beside its mother, trembling, making soft, distressed sounds. My stomach dropped like a stone. Someone had shot her. Jack watched me, his eyes full of something I can only describe as pleading. He knew I was different from other humans. He knew I had helped them before. Now he was asking me, begging me, to help again. I knelt beside Sarah, my hands shaking. The wound was serious. The entry point was small, probably a rifle round, and there was no exit wound. The bullet was still inside her. I looked up at Jack and told him I'd return with supplies. I don't know if he understood my words, but he understood my intent. I ran back through the forest, my lungs burning, branches whipping my face. I drove recklessly back to my cabin, my mind racing. I couldn't call for help. Bringing a doctor was impossible. Reporting it would expose them to authorities, to curiosity seekers, to those who would exploit them. I was their only option. I grabbed everything I had: medical gauze, antibiotic ointment, iodine, pain relievers I ground into powder, bottled water, but when I turned to leave, I froze. My cabin window, the one facing the tree line, was open. I never left it open. And on the counter lay a sheet of notebook paper with handwriting that wasn't mine. Bold, heavy strokes like someone unused to writing. It said simply, "Don't go back there." My blood ran cold. Someone had been here, someone who knew, but I couldn't let that stop me. I grabbed my supplies and returned to the forest. When I reached the grove, Sarah looked worse. Her breathing was more labored, her eyes barely focusing. I worked as carefully as I could. I cleaned the wound with water and iodine, packed it with antibiotic ointment and gauze. The bullet was lodged deep, and I knew removing it with my limited tools could cause more damage, could kill her faster from blood loss or shock. So I left it, focusing on preventing infection and stopping the external bleeding. It took over an hour. Sarah flinched and groaned, but didn't fight me. Jack stood watch over us, his eyes constantly scanning the forest. When I finally finished, Sarah's breathing had steadied slightly. The bleeding had slowed. It wasn't a cure, but it was a chance. Jack made a soft sound, one I'd learned meant gratitude. The juvenile gently pressed its forehead to Sarah's, a gesture of comfort and connection. They huddled together, breathing as one, a family bound by love and survival. I was about to tell them I'd return the next day when I heard it. A branch crack, sharp and deliberate, then voices, human voices, speaking low and purposeful. 3 men emerged from the fog. Like phantoms, they wore camouflage, carried rifles, moved with the confidence of experienced hunters. And they were heading straight for us. Jack rose to his full height immediately. He positioned himself between the hunters and his family, a living wall of muscle and determination. My heart slammed against my ribs. These men hadn't stumbled upon us. They'd been tracking Sarah, following the blood trail. The hunters stopped when they saw us, surprise flickering across their faces. Then recognition. The tallest one narrowed his eyes at me. "McKenna?" he said, his voice hard. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I raised my hand slowly, my mind racing. "You need to leave. Right now." The man's expression shifted from surprise to understanding, then to something darker. "You've been the one," he said slowly, "all these years, redirecting hunts, filing false reports. Should have known it was you." Another hunter raised his rifle slightly. "Do you have any idea what these things are worth?" I stepped forward, positioning myself between them and Jack's family. "They're not things. They're not hostile. They just want to be left alone." "They're animals, McKenna," the leader said coldly. "Valuable animals." "There's no season for them," I shot back. "No permits. What you're doing is murder." Jack made a sound behind me, low and resonant. Not a threat, but something else. A plea. A statement of existence. The juvenile was trembling, clutching Sarah's arm. Sarah herself struggled to sit up, her eyes fierce despite her injury. "You shoot any of them," I said, my voice dropping low, "and you'll prove everything they've ever believed about us, that humans are the real monsters." For a long moment, nobody moved. The forest held its breath. 3 rifles, a wounded mother, a frightened young one, and a father trying to protect his family, and me standing in the middle of it all, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Then Jack did something extraordinary. He took a single step forward, not threatening, not aggressive. He simply stood tall, his full height and presence impossible to ignore. He made that same sound again, deeper this time, more resonant. And in that moment, the hunters saw what I had seen all those years ago. Not a monster, not a myth, not a trophy, a father, a husband. A being with thoughts and feelings and the right to exist. The leader's jaw clenched. His finger moved near the trigger, then away. He looked from Jack to Sarah to the juvenile, then back to me. Something in his expression shifted. Doubt, maybe, or the faint shadow of conscience awakening. "This is insane," one of the other hunters muttered. "We came all this way." "Forget it," the leader said finally, his voice rough. "They're moving deeper anyway. We'll never track them in this fog." He lowered his rifle. "You're playing a dangerous game, McKenna." They turned and walked back into the fog, their footsteps gradually fading until the forest swallowed them completely. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, before my legs nearly gave out. I leaned against a cedar trunk, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and relief. Jack's head bowed, not in defeat, but in gratitude. Sarah breathed easier. The immediate crisis passed. The juvenile let out a trembling sigh and touched its father's arm, seeking reassurance. But I knew this wasn't over. I looked at Jack and told him what he already understood. "They'll come back. Maybe not today, but someday. You need to go deeper, farther into the mountains where people don't go." Jack looked toward the snow-capped peaks, visible through gaps in the trees, places where even rangers rarely patrolled, places where they might finally be safe. He understood. Over the next few days, Sarah recovered enough to move. I checked on them twice more, bringing fresh supplies, watching as Sarah slowly regained her strength. When they were ready, the family came to our meeting spot one last time. Jack placed his hand on the cedar trunk, the gesture we'd shared for years. Then he placed his hand on his own chest, home, memory. Then he reached forward and rested his hand over my heart. Thank you. Goodbye. A passing of trust. They turned and walked into the mist together. Three shapes moving as one, fading until they became part of the forest. I stood there long after they disappeared, tears streaming, knowing I'd never see them again, but grateful beyond words. I retired in 2016, 30 years after that first encounter. Sometimes when hikers report strange sounds or impossibly large footprints, I smile. Because somewhere beyond where roads end, a family still walks beneath the cedars. On clear days, I make the hike to that granite outcropping. I still leave apples there. They're always gone by morning. Maybe Jack still remembers. Maybe he tells his grandchildren about the human who brought them food and asked nothing except to be trusted. Some secrets aren't meant to be solved. Some promises are kept in silence, honored with respect and protection. I spent 40 years guarding their secret, but I needed to tell this story once, to make sure someone knows they're real, they're intelligent, they're worthy of protection, and they're still out there, still surviving, still hoping that someday humanity might prove worthy of sharing this world with them.